Ladies and gentlemen, my pleasure to welcome you back to our third panel. We have 4 speakers. I have been duly authorized by the Institute to be merciless as a moderator. We will keep them on time, but specifically to leave time for a question and answer. The topic of this panel is Russian foreign policy and military developments in the region. And our first speaker is Professor Andrzej Nowak, with a background originally in the underground journalism of Poland. He is currently the professor of Eastern European Studies at Jagiellonian University and an expert in such delightful things as imperiological studies. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very kind introduction and invitation for this conference. As we don't have much time, I will start directly with this question: where does Russian foreign policy come from? For many analysts, the answer is exclusively connected to Russian internal policy, or even, to put it simply, to President Putin and his cronies' material interests. Karen Davisha, a political scientist at Miami University in Ohio, gives a very succinct name for this phenomenon: kleptocracy. It would be enough to buy Putin with a possibility to keep this kleptocracy intact, with its economic interests based on oil and gas export, and everything would go okay? No, I think it's not that easy. Kleptocracy is not enough to understand this foreign policy. Others suggest that the only driving power of Putin's foreign policy is his intention to prolong his stay in power, to discourage anything that could endanger his regime, be it Western-sponsored orange or other color revolutions, or any challenge that could come even from his KGB cronies feeling that Putin is becoming weaker. So he must win constantly on every front. The suggestion for answering such an interpretation of Russian foreign policy would be that the West should stop provoking Putin with its dreams of democratization, of civil human rights, and so on and so forth. I think this internal key to Russian foreign policy is also not enough. So the third answer that is quite frequent among American and Western specialists dealing with the subject of Russian foreign policy is that it is driven by somehow natural behavior of a great power to keep its internal geopolitical backyard intact. I would like to quote, though without pleasure actually, 2 examples of such an attitude or interpretation taken from recent issues of foreign affairs. Very important, as everybody knows here, Forum for American Political Analysts. First, from John Mearsheimer, Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault. The article was published in October last year. So Mearsheimer from Chicago University ridicules a vision of Putin as a modern-day Adolf Hitler and the suggestion that striking any kind of deal with him would repeat the mistake of Munich. Actually, Mearsheimer advocates such a deal. He tries to suggest that Putin doesn't want to create any greater Russia, and that he cannot create a greater Russia because he has no military nor economic means to do it. Well, there are better specialists than me here to answer this rather unwise suggestion, I believe. All that Putin wants, Mearsheimer states, reasonably so, is to make the West, the EU and NATO, to abandon their plans to westernize Russian borderlands, Ukraine, Georgia, and so on. But the problem with this suggestion is where these borderlands, Russian legitimate borderlands, end. With Ukraine, with Crimea, or maybe with Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, maybe with Poland. Where does it lead? I should quote very, I would say, critical remarks done by John Merxheimer in his article. One hears the claim, this is quotation, that Ukraine has the right to determine whom it wants to ally with, and the Russians have no right to prevent Kiev from joining the West. This is a dangerous way for Ukraine to think about its foreign policy choices. The sad truth is that might often makes right when great power politics are at play. Abstract rights, such as self-determination, are largely meaningless when powerful states get into brawls with weaker states. Here you have answer for your appeal to Republican values and so on and so forth. And to continue, even if one rejects, continues Professor Merxheimer, this analysis and believes that Ukraine has the right to petition to join the EU and NATO, the fact remains that the United States and its European allies have the right to reject these requests. There is no reason that the West has to accommodate Ukraine if it is bent on pursuing a wrong-headed foreign policy, especially if its defense is not a vital interest. Indulging the dreams of some Ukrainians is not worth the animosity and strife it will cause, especially for the Ukrainian people. So the West, so to speak, or at least Professor Merxheimer, knows better what is good for Ukrainians, that it is better to leave Ukraine to Putin than to let Ukrainians decide about their future. And another and the last example of the same, much more, I would say, popular attitude here in the States, especially among political scientists. This is taken from the latest issue of Foreign Affairs by Professor Stephen Kotkin, The Irresistible Rise of Vladimir Putin. Again, a quotation. Distasteful as it may sound, Washington faces the prospect of trying to work out some negotiated larger territorial settlement. Such negotiations would have to acknowledge that Russia is a great power with leverage. But they would not need to involve the formal acceptance of some special Russian sphere of interest in its so-called near abroad. I would add my commentary that for Professor Kotkin, the informal acceptance would do, just like at Yalta. In Yalta conference, there was no formal acceptance, but just informal acceptance. So Professor Kotkin concludes that NATO expansion was a strategic error, and what is necessary now is the creation of an entirely new trans-European security architecture, one that fully transcends its Cold War counterpart. How can we answer this kind of attitude? We had to answer this question first. Does Putin have convictions that motivate his foreign policy? Well, yes. They originate from two sources. One is his experience in KGB, which formed his specific type of Soviet imperial patriotism. It takes pride and all meaning from serving the great, possibly the greatest empire, to serve with all means against all enemies. And actually, there are only enemies around, with the United States at the center of this evil encirclement. Second source of Putin's convictions is formed by his passion for the martial arts of East Asia. Of course, not Taekwondo mentioned by Ambassador Povilionis, but I mean these martial arts that are or were transformed in the Soviet realities. Putin's favorite Sambo technique comprises not just skills, but a certain anthropological and philosophical attitude. First, to deceive. One can always deceive his enemy using as little force as one has in order to find weak spots in his enemy and to hit unexpectedly. Professor Olga Krysztanowskaja from Russian Academy of Sciences calls a combination of these two influences in Putin's person as forming one imperial, as she calls, personality. Russia as empire is an extension and the core at the same time of this imperial outlook. Putin is an adamant adherent of the idea of Russian empire. On this point, and this is important to stress this fact, he enjoys support from the majority of the Russian political elites. But how to serve the Russian Empire in the 21st century realities? Geodemographics, so to speak, and geoeconomics are relentless. Russia, with its now 143 or 4 with Crimea million people, is now 10 times smaller than China with 1.4 billion people. And also in economic terms, Russia is 10 times smaller than China. To the south, there is India with 1.2 billion people, and the belt of Islamic states extending its external ring into the old borders of the Soviet Union, or even now the borders of the Russian Federation. It is important to remind that nowadays up to 20% of the Russian Federation population are Islamic people, and this ratio is quickly growing. So, to conclude this very short part, Russia is and will be shrinking in Asia. This is inevitable. The question is, how fast? Putin is looking for an answer, for a weak spot. Where he can find this weak spot? Only in one direction, in the West. This is the only weak spot on the map. So first of all, in Ukraine. Ukraine is just an element of a broader concept necessary for Putin's vision of Russian Empire. That is so-called Ruski Mir concept, that is Russian world. It should comprise both Ukraine and Belarusia in order to strengthen Eastern Slavic element necessary in this demographic internal fight for sustaining capabilities of the Russian Federation vis-à-vis its fast-growing Islamic population and Islamic neighbors. So Russia needs Ukrainians as future Russians, and Russia needs Belarusians as future Russians as well. In Ukraine, that within old borders of the Soviet Union is just one of the elements of this concept, then Russia is looking for an answer for its grave situation vis-à-vis Asiatic neighbors, also in its former external empire, stretching from Poland to Bulgaria, and finally in Europe as a whole. Russian expansion is and could be only westward, because to the west, Russia meets less determination, less will to defend, and more possibilities to divide and to intimidate. And here, Putin can lean on a Russian long-term strategy, much older than Putin himself, to disunite the West, to divide Western Europe from East Central Europe, to divide Europe from the United States, to divide Eastern Europe from East Central Europe, These are, I would say, main goals in this strategy. Moscow tries to persuade Western Europe and US that all Russia wants is not in the perimeter of their, that is, Western interest. Moscow tries to persuade the US that there are far more important theaters for cooperation in Asia especially than Eastern European Russian imperial backyard is worth. The best way to achieve this goal is not with a prospect of Russian military invasion or a real war, but with a prospect of this year, May 9th, victory parade in Moscow, where Putin, along with Chinese president and Indian prime minister, would show a specter of anti-Western coalition, with Russia as a key element in it. With an implied suggestion, it would be so cheap to take Russia back to the Western side, just Crimea, maybe Ukraine, so cheap indeed. It is so much easier to intimidate Europe than the US, with economic leverages, from Nord Stream to Mistral type of leverages, and with military blackmail in the specter of the war in Europe itself. One should mention the concept of strategic deterrence, point 26 of May 2009 Russian National Security Strategy to 2020, which enables Russia to use all political, diplomatic, military, economic, and informational means in order to deter any danger from its borders. So, to deter Europe, Russia uses all these methods. Russia, it is necessary to put it bluntly, has a revisionist agenda under which she is seeking to change the post-Cold War settlement of Europe through an information war and, if necessary, by military force. Let us remind its stages very briefly, beginning with the controlled collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. First, from the same year, Yuli Kwieciński and Valentin Falin doctrine to use gas and oil export instead of tanks as means of controlling the outer zone of the Soviet Empire. Then Andrzej Kozyriev and its concept of near abroad, already mentioned, connected to the so-called Balladur Plan, where Russia tried to enforce on Europe its right to control minority situation in all Eastern Europe. Then, next very important element in this strategy was to disunite any real collaboration within the intermarium, to strengthen all these self-destructive quarrels that were mentioned by Professor Chodakiewicz. I will give just one example. When in May 92, President of Ukraine Kravchuk visited Warsaw proposing a nuclear pact with Warsaw, Lech Wałęsa went to Moscow completely, I would say, disregarding this proposal. And actually this helped Poland to a degree and in a short run, because next year President Yeltsin visited Warsaw and gave consent, though very briefly, for Poland joining NATO, because for Russia it was much lesser evil to have Poland in NATO than to have Polish-Ukrainian nuclear axis. To disunite Poland and Ukraine, to disunite Poland and Lithuania, these are evident goals of the Russian strategy. Okay. Then we have already mentioned Georgian war in 2008, preceded by famous or rather infamous Putin's speech in Munich conference in February 2007, where he declared the Atlanticism as his main enemy. Then we have Obama's reset, President Obama reset from 2009. And finally we have April 10th, 2010, Smolensk catastrophe. And not just the catastrophe itself, but the way Polish government reacted. sent waves throughout all the Eastern Europe. The situation where Polish sovereign government capitulated, resigned from any chance of fair investigation, giving all the instruments for Putin's cronies such as Vladimir Dziak, was an evident sign that Poland resigned from any active policy in Eastern Europe. And this had consequences. Ukraine capitulated very soon, giving actually Sevastopol to Putin once again. Then Hungary of Viktor Orban, then Slovakia, now Greece. And many new forms of manipulation, division, and intimidation were really effective. As I have to finish, I will finish on this short note. All these forms, both mentioned and not mentioned yet, of manipulation and intimidation are aimed to achieve more Mearsheimer and Kotkin-like attitude here in the States, in the West. It is just about Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova or Lithuania or Poland or any other of these faraway countries of which we know nothing, to use Neville Chamberlain words from Munich conference, or about those countries who are constant source of troubles for the last 500 years, to use Franklin Delano Roosevelt infamous words on Poland uttered during the Yalta Conference. This is exactly to persuade Western political elites that the countries of this region that are not acknowledged as wholly Western should be left. But such an appeasement could be just another method of enfeebling the West as such, its moral identity, its self-respect, necessary for its self-defense. When the West operates just on might is right principle, realist principle, it capitulates not just to Putin's blackmail, but to this same imperial logic that makes Putin victorious. So maybe I will stop on this note, which is so similar to Dr. Gurka note. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Just one quote, I think, that was so striking from the article quoted, that you can have a mainstream academic in what was the most prestigious journal of these issues in America write that self-determination is a wrong-headed policy for a country is really very, very sobering. Thank you, Professor. I now invite Dr. Dziak, one of the standard bearers of the Cold War in the intelligence and counterintelligence domain. He is the author of the seminal text Czechisti and an expert on what it means to model your state on the secret police apparatus. Jack, please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Seb, and good afternoon to you all. Title of my talk, you'll see in quotes, "The New Hybrid War and the New Subversion of Putin's Imperium." I put the quotes there because I think a lot of the imputation associated with this business of newness loses an awful lot. So let me give a little background before I get into certain specifics, and I'll walk through some laundry lists of what some of this means. I spent over 30 years as an intelligence officer doing a whole variety of things. And in the last several years of my career is when the Soviet Union imploded. It was a welcome sight to watch that. But following the collapse of the USSR, an abiding legend took hold in Washington almost immediately, that pieces broken out and you got very prominent articles turned into books on by Francis Fukuyama on democracy is the future of the world and so forth. And associated with that, and along with that, you found a diminution of the elimination of our talent, especially within the intelligence community, on the Soviet Union. I mean, the place was purged. I watched it happen. I had people who were fluent in Russian calling me up and begging me for work to do some translation because they were thrown out of work. People were encouraged to retire. And to underscore this, I'll give you a couple of vignettes here from my personal experience. In 1992, that's 1 year after the Soviet Union collapsed, a very senior friend of mine, I was in the Office of the Secretary of Defense at the time working a rather sensitive program, and a very senior friend who was a senior career counterintelligence official in OSD asked me if I would go with him to a senior political appointee to try to convince that person that the Russians, 1 year after the collapse of the Soviet Union, not only didn't diminish their intelligence operations against us in the United States, and we're talking only about the United States at the time, but they actually increased them. One could argue at the time that the KGB, because it was being downsized and torn apart slightly, diminished its operations slightly, but the GRU, Russian military intelligence, was on a roll, and their chart was going up. So we went to this individual, and the idea was that my friend would make a pitch, and I would represent what he was pitching with examples of their operations. What was supposed to be a 20-minute meeting ended up being about 7 or 8 minutes. We were thrown out of the office. I must admit I was thrown out of better places. But we were thrown out of the office and dismissed as dinosaurs. Now, this was not a Democratic administration, okay? That's how quickly that attitude took hold. Another one, roughly during that period, in that time period when the Soviet Union was attriting, a very senior Soviet intelligence official, a former Soviet intelligence official, appeared at the U.S. Embassy in a certain European country and offering to defect with suitcases loaded with intelligence data. We threw him back, literally. He was a little discouraged, and he knew that he had crossed the Rubicon, and so he went to the Brits. And God bless the Brits, they said, "Welcome, comrade." And his name was Mitrokin. You may have seen his stuff. It was printed up in a couple of books, co-authored by Christopher Andrew. The reason he was thrown back was the station chief, with concurrence back from headquarters and CIA, was a piece had broken up. And we don't do this kind of stuff anymore. I mean, this actually happened. All right, so couple that up with the examples I gave you before. So that generates a mindset, not only in the United States among our policy and intelligence elites, but we saw the same thing happening in Europe as well. So you get to Crimea and Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, and despite the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, a syndrome took hold of our perception of reality, both there in Europe and here, that wars don't break out in Europe anymore. Okay, so when it did happen in 2014, there was a great deal of denial, and we could still see that denial ongoing today. So following the invasion of Crimea and the proxy war in eastern Ukraine, effusive commentary came out among people who should know better, especially, on new kinds of war, hybrid war for one, and new subversion. Okay, old wine in new bottles, coupled with failed memory and failed will. Okay. I'm not here to argue that new strange things are not going on. I am here to argue that we have to keep some perspective and regain a sense of history that we as an ahistorical country simply have lost. Okay, let me go through some of the persistence of the old Soviet ways and capabilities. First, the KGB, my favorite secret police. I tend to use that term KGB generically, even though it's no longer called KGB. internally in Russia today, they still refer to the span of the intelligence and security services as KGB. So I'll be referring to that. Despite the downsizing and splitting up, there was no decommunization, a la the denazification that we saw, or that we carried out in Germany after World War II. So the ideology may have been thrown overboard to a certain extent. I mean, there's no more Communist Party. But the modalities of their operation persisted. There was a continuity of influence operations, active measures, the preferred Russian term, deception, disinformation, provocations, provokatia is one of their favorite terms that covers a whole galaxy of sins in this kind of thing. The institutional networks for them especially. These increased, and especially since Putin came to power in 2000. I was in Hungary at the time, in Budapest, celebrating with family and friends the coming of the new millennium, and one of the most disappointing things to hear was that Putin was selected by Yeltsin to replace Yeltsin. Should have seen the reaction among the Hungarians. They knew what was coming. These increased and were facilitated by Putin's virtual control of the totality of the Russian media. And then along with the attendant trolls of alleged independent hackers, bloggers, and various media outlets, much of this then was, what they were doing was trumpeted by the likes of RT, which has a great impact here in the United States, and then even picked up by Al Jazeera and other outlets like that. That resonates going back to what they did in the Cold War. Things where the KGB would plant things in the third world media, they would play it, and then it was picked up by European media, and then picked up by the United States media, including even such horrible nonsense as the United States was in the business of purchasing baby parts. Okay? And that was repeated in the US media. Such nonsense. The KGB was initially broken up under Yeltsin, and I had the good fortune of meeting and working with, for a short while, a Russian judge who was being hosted by a personal family friend who was a federal judge here in the United States, and he had some experience in intelligence. And this Russian judge's major concern was, how do we get control in Russia over the uncontrolled KGB? And he understood that if it wasn't done then, in the early 1990s, it was never going to be done. And we know how that turned out. As soon as Putin comes in, one of the first things we see is a recollection of the elements of the old KGB back into a unified FSB. The only two elements that are still outstanding that had been part of a plethora of broken up KGB elements is the Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, which came from the old First Chief Directorate, and, no surprise here, the bodyguards of Putin. They're a standalone service. They didn't chop back to the FSB. But even that is not new, because that's just a repeat of Stalin's policy, and Putin likes Stalin. Maybe he doesn't like him because he killed so many people, but he liked the way that he kept control. Putin understands that. And so you run your own counterintelligence service as part of your bodyguards. The GRU downsized somewhat, but it quickly built back up and is now running operations at Cold War levels, along with the KGB, with the FSB and the SVR in Western Europe and the United States and elsewhere. In fact, given the size of the Spetsnaz dimension of the Russian intelligence empire, and remember, in the Soviet Union and in Russia, special forces do not belong to the military. They're under the control of the intelligence and security services. KGB has special forces, I should say, the FSB has them, the SVR has them, Foreign Intelligence Service, the GRU has them, and the MVD has them. They all have special forces. And guess who is playing in Crimea and eastern Ukraine? The little green men that you saw are the successors to the Spetsnaz brigades that were organic to every single Soviet military district and the 4 fleet areas of the Soviet Navy. And guess who was down at Sevastopol? A GRU Spetsnaz brigade that was part of the Russian Navy. And then as part of that too, that continuity of special operations, Simferopol had been a major Spetsnaz training center for foreign terrorists under the Soviet Union. Okay, he's bigger than me, so I'm going to behave. Active measures, provocation, all these things continued and are part and parcel of this new subversive and new hybrid war that we're seeing. It's new not to the Russians and their Soviet predecessors, or the Ukrainians understand it's not new, East Europeans understand it's not new. It's new primarily to us because we lost that continuity that I began this discussion with. We knew how to counter this stuff at one time. And this was organic to the way we operated. Back in the 1980s, the Soviets had mounted an ugly and massive active measures campaign against us. Against a lot of opposition within the government, especially within State Department and in CIA and certain other places, we mounted a counter-active measures operation, counter-active measures working group. It worked at 2 levels. One level in the public diplomacy realm, the other level in the intelligence realm. And they were very, very successful. We knew how to do this. A colleague of ours from the Institute of World Politics, now deceased, and one of the greatest minds on Soviet active measures and Communist Party operations, Herb Rosenstein, was so good at countering Soviet propaganda, active measures, deception, disinformation. When he would go to something that was a Communist front operation, he would travel all over the world. I went with him on some of these. And the Soviets would learn that Herb was going to be there, they'd cancel out. That's how good he was. Of course, it helped that he had been a communist in his misbegotten youth, and he understood the dialectic. All right, just a few more things. There was one other that I want to bring up, and that is the whole business of special operations, Spetsnaz. We have experience there as well. Back in the late 70s and early 80s, I worked with the Brits on a joint US-UK operation countering Spetsnaz operations. So we know how to do that. There was a deposit of knowledge and experience. But come 1992, this was largely ripped out of the intelligence community. So just a few more things, and I'll run very quickly through them. KGB, GRU penetration of the Ukrainian intelligence and security services. It's not unique to Ukraine. Every former member of the 15 constituent republics of the Soviet Union has that problem in the near abroad and in other former members of the Warsaw Pact. In fact, the Ukrainian problem was especially difficult because Ukraine was the second largest republic. Upwards of, I've seen figures and talked with people in that area of the world, upwards of maybe 80% of the Ukrainian service was reporting back to Moscow. Provocations at Maidan, okay, back during the demonstrations. Deception and disinformation operations aimed at Western Europe and the U.S. during the whole time from Crimea, before Crimea, during Crimea, and after Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. And in fact, the whole business of the Olympics at Sochi was part of a major active measure information op to deflect Western attention from what was coming down, as Seb had mentioned earlier this morning, what was coming down as a long plan operation in Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. So all of our attention was focused on that, and there was a bogus campaign arguing that there was going to be a major terrorist strike at Sochi. Never happened, did it? Okay, just a few other things. And finally, the economic threats which were addressed by previous speakers. Very quickly, a couple of conclusions and lessons noted. I won't call them lessons learned because I'm arguing that we didn't learn the lessons. So lessons noted. Concurrent with all of what I had just mentioned heretofore, one of the things that was not present, or among the things not present during the Cold War, which are present now, which makes our situation a little more difficult. Putin is facing a NATO that is greatly diminished militarily, and Putin fully understands this. During the Cold War, NATO had a fist. There's a general loss of will in the West, not only in Europe, but in the United States. And there's an abdication of U.S. leadership. Putin doesn't do what he's doing in a vacuum. There is an interactive perceptual understanding. His perception is focused on what I just mentioned: loss of will, loss of military clout, loss of U.S. leadership. Okay, I've said enough.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Chris Zawitkowski, who has a storied career in the U.S. defense industry, serving on numerous boards of directors. He is also formerly on the board of directors of the Canadian Polish Congress and national director of the Polish-American Congress. So we've got some slides for this presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. And after speaking after so distinguished scholars, historians, and experts on intelligence and economy, it's a difficult task that is laid in front of the engineer. But I have to be practical, and I need to cut the time so we can have the session of question and answers. Here's my name, and I would like to show you the complexity of the area before we move into the present military situation. As you can see on this map, we have a very complex situation in Europe, but basically we can say that there are four groups of different languages. We have Slavs, we have Nordic nation, which is Russia, Poland, stretches from Arctic Ocean all the way to the Black Sea and Adriatic. We have Romanic nations, we have Nordic nations, and we have some I call it enclaves, which is, Hungarians and Romanians, which are also partially Romanic, and Greeks and Finnish. And this map also allows me to show you a little bit. We are talking about this region here, where used to be several different countries. There was the United Commonwealth of Lithuania and Poland. I say it purposely because when they got together in 1413, Lithuania was a bigger country than Poland. And just to tell Mr. Ambassador, he's not with us, but he doesn't like to hear that Lithuania is smaller, but it was bigger some time ago. And we are talking about a Ruthenian state, which stretched from the Black Sea all the way to the north, which included its capital in Kiev. Moscow was a small city, and north of Moscow there was a duchy of Novgorod Veliki, or Great, which stretched actually from the Baltic coast almost to the Ural Mountains. And everybody knows that in Leningrad or Petersburg there is a street of Alexander Nevsky Prospect. Alexander Nevsky was the Duke of Novgorod, not of Russia. He was from descendant of the Duke, Grand Duke Vladimir and Rurik, as a matter of fact. Anyway, and in this situation, we have a particular country, which is Russia, and Professor Nowak was telling us a little bit about the complexity of Russian foreign policy, and I like to refer to the complexity of the Russian military doctrine. And for your convenience, I took an engineering approach and made a tabulation of the issues that Russian military doctrines over the last, say, 20 years were identifying as the major issues that may cause Russian concern and Russian concern for war. What is act of war? What is act of intervention, etc.? And as you can see on this tabulation, the Russian policy basically doesn't change very much. It's remaining pretty much the same. The language changes a little bit. Honestly, I read all those doctrines, and I try to read them in Russian even. I know Russian from high school. And the last one I even translated to English. But anyway, I was interested also, and I listed for your convenience, how easily Russia can consider something as an act of war or hostile act against her positions, her priorities, and her people, and even her allies. In the latest military doctrine, Russia even broadened a little bit also what she considered the territory of her concern. And added, this I'm talking about doctrine of December 26, 2014. This doctrine allows Russia to intervene when Russian allies are threatened, when there is even concentration of armed forces on the borders of Russian allies, not necessarily Russia, or when even there are situations when there are like riots or acts of terrorism against the friends of Russia or allies of Russia. And namely, there are also listed some of the Russian allies in their military doctrine, like Belarus, like Ossetia. And I also looked into the situation how Russia, according to her doctrine, would respond to any threat that she considers vital for her security. And I am showing for your convenience also how it was evolving through the century, through these 20 years. And Russia always allowed, in her policy, military policy, allowed the use of conventional military forces, direct intervention. This happened in Georgia when Russia attacked Georgia and was ready to capture even Tbilisi, when actually the bold and very brave act of the 6 presidents led by Lech Kaczynski, president of Poland, they themselves, as the living shield, they stopped the Russian attack. And Russia allows the use of weapons of mass destruction and use of tactical nuclear weapons if they are used or if they are maybe used. What is also very important, Russia since year 2000 is allowing the possibility of use of non-tactical warheads. One should remember that Russia has over 2,000 non-tactical warheads in Kaliningrad, which is directly adjacent to Poland. And when Poland was planning to have the anti-missile rockets, Russia understood it's a hostile move towards Russia because Poland should not defend herself. And Poland never concurred to refrain from strengthening her military forces in any agreements that were made. It was an agreement between Shevardnadze and Baker that the sphere between Russia and NATO would remain non-military. This states, first of all, the state of Soviet Union does not exist anymore, so the agreement is not binding, although Russia claimed that she is the successor of Soviet Union. And what I like to emphasize on this chart is the last point, that Russia is identifying United States of America as a main enemy of Russia. And we have to remember about this. Of course, we don't know what is classified part of the Russian military doctrine, but this is what was published. And I like to bring a little bit of historical perspective. Apparently, I was going to show you how Russia in the past was dealing with her neighbors that she had an appetite for. And I can bring the examples for you, how Russia dealt with countries like Novgorod, Veliki, like Poland, like Afghanistan, like Ukraine. And they started first with a friendly contact. Russia always develops on the beginning friendly contact when they are good buddies. You know, they serve, you know, hot dogs and barbecue. Ambassador can barbecue the hot dogs and then offer everybody stolichная. He's a nice man, you know. And then Novgorod, for example, invited Ivan the Terrible to come and visit the city. And so he did. You know, he came and he even was so keen to have some resolutions made, you know, when there was actually a dispute, legal dispute between rioting poor people and rich merchants of Novgorod, you know. And then he left, you know. But apparently the courts of Novgorod didn't listen to his advice, and they had to punish the criminals that were causing terrible problems in Novgorod. Well, you know, then what Ivan the Terrible did, you know, he got upset. He sent an envoy to Novgorod telling them that he's really upset with the fact that they are not listening to him. And then what next was done, you know, he moved swiftly with his armies, captured Novgorod, you know, and resettled about 90% of its citizens to different parts of Russia when the rest was left. And then he brought some Russians from other area to live in Novgorod. This way, the truly democratic Republic of Novgorod, which had a duke, but duke was a contract duke, you know, like Nevsky was a contract duke. There was Polish Prince Glinski, who was also the Duke of Novgorod, you know. Anyway, and what happened, then Russia is taking sides in this particular country. For example, in Poland, there were minorities like Protestants, like Orthodox. So Russia in 18th century was supporting actually those minorities and claiming herself to be the defender of the rights of people, you know. This is causing problems. And then when the country doesn't listen to what Russia is recommending, there is usually some riots, like in Novgorod, or you know, the uprising in Poland, you know, or movements, turmoils. For example, in Crimea, or there was rising, you know, Russian citizens, you know, or Ukrainian citizens of Russian origin. They started turmoils, and we know these were people actually that were brought from Russia. Then Russia is taking sides, of course. You know, doesn't matter whether it's friendly for Russia or unfriendly, they take an opportunity. In Poland, it was unfriendly Confederation of Bar. So they take sides. And eventually it leads to military intervention. And this is what we are seeing right now in Ukraine. We saw everything like this in Poland, we saw in some other countries, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, and eventually Russia is incorporating the territory if it is possible. And this is what happened, for example, with Ukraine. Russia fought for Ukraine for 300 years. Do you think that Russia would give up Ukraine easily? It wouldn't. Let's for a moment have a look at how Ukraine was in 1991. Well, they had an army trained by Soviet methods, indeed, but it was 780,000 troops. They had also about 6,000 tanks. They had about 4,000 armored vehicles. They had about 1,500 fighter jets. They had, or planes, I should say. And they had artillery, and they had over 1,200 nuclear warheads. This is what we heard, that Ukraine proposed this nuclear alliance for Poland. You know, the Russians, when they left Poland, they also left 6 nuclear warheads by mistake. They left the bases and they left the warheads. But Poland, of course, asked Americans to help to disarm those weapons. And what are we dealing with right now? You know, we are dealing with the secession of some Ukrainian provinces, because in one province in Lugansk, Russians are about 62% of the population, and in Donetsk, there are less Russians. They are not the majority. This is why Russians don't progress very well in Donetsk. But they are progressing south to join Crimea. And we have Zaporozhye, another province on the way of Russian armies. Who are the insurgents of the Lugansk and Donetsk? These people are equipped with 120, 150 millimeter artillery. They have tanks, they have air force, they have surveillance electronics, they have guidance systems. They are very well equipped. And imagine they did this almost in no time. I always wonder how it was possible for the workers of the Dnipropetrovsk, where incidentally Leonid Brezhnev served as an engineer, or in some other places, how they were able to gather such arms without sustaining effort of the Kremlin. We heard a few days ago during the Putin's long interview in Russian television, when he was asked by one of the Russians, is this true that we have Russian troops in Ukraine? And Putin said, I didn't sign the order. Did you sign? So nobody signed, so there are no Russian troops. This is what they claim. But Ukrainians captured some insurgents that were having proofs of being on the payroll, not only on the payroll, being officers of the Russian army. Well, and these days Ukrainian army is no longer as big as it used to be in 1991. It's about 200,000, which includes only about 50,000 deployed. And the rest is pretty much trained, better or worse, but they are trained and ready for combat, probably. What do we have on the other side? What do we have on the other side? This is a very interesting thing. I'm showing you the map of Ukraine, and you can see this is Kharkov. Kharkov is the province which is very closely tied with Russia, and probably about 80% of production of Kharkov area goes to Russia, which includes some components for nuclear use and for nuclear energy and for nuclear weapons. And we see between Kharkiv and Pskov, which is north of the Belarus, we see about 15 Russian divisions spread along the Belarusian border. Along the Ukrainian border, we see about 10 Russian divisions. Everything is of Spetsnaz and special forces. They are, thank you. They are all combat ready. They are all combat ready since about 15th of March. something is holding them, of course, and this is an answer for political scholars and politicians to answer. I'm just an engineer. And against Russia, we have Germany with about 161,000 troops. We have Poland, which has about 100,000 troops, plus about 20,000 in reserve. And we have Russia that has about 2 million troops available, which is about 1,027,000 in European theater. And we have loads of equipment. About between 250 and 350,000 Russian troops are combat ready. What does it mean combat ready? They went through very extensive maneuvering and training, like Zapad 2009 that was mentioned today, which was incidentally, for those that don't know, it was maneuver provoked by quote-unquote Polish terrorists that migrated from Lithuania to Belarus and tried to capture part of Belarus, which is populated with Poles and Lithuanians, and take it away from Belarus. What Russians responded with? Apparently invasion of Baltic coast. This was simulated, of course, and with nuclear attack, non-tactical attack, below 1 kiloton on Warsaw. This is what the Russian army is training. And let's face it, this is the reality that we may be facing. And I like to show you also that the Russian industry, military defense industry, is located basically along the Belarusian and Ukrainian borders all the way up to Kazakhstan. And interesting is also this map. This map shows you how the nuclear ballistic missiles are located. And I could go in great detail, but our chairman allows me only 5 minutes to wrap it up. One left. We have Iskander, we have Bulavas, we have don't forget, we have Dolgoruki traversing Pacific from time to time. This submarine, the largest submarine, is equipped with 11 Bulava warheads. And they can reach spots in the United States as well. And what I wanted to show you is what really those countries need, like Poland, Lithuania. They need more sophisticated AWACS system, which is to control the borders and see the maneuvering of the Russian troops. What I wanted only to add finally, that in her past, Russia did not refrain from arresting the politicians of other country, did not arrest from even killing. They either through the process, like a legal process, when they arrested 16 leaders of Poland after the war, immediately after the war, and sentenced them, some to death and some to life imprisonment. Only 3 of them left the prison. And Russia also can pursue with the act of terror, like downing of the Dutch airliner, and don't forget about the downing of the presidential plane that Lech Kaczynski flew to commemorate the Polish soldiers. What this downing accomplished was actually to eliminate the 4 generals, 4 NATO generals, our close allies. One of them was considered to maybe become even the commander of the NATO forces in Europe. One of the most brilliant Air Force commanders, General Blasik, was on the plane too, trained here in Denver, in our academy, and the leaders of the country. And for your convenience, I like to mention that we have here on our audience Minister Macierewicz from Poland, who is the chairman of the of the committee that is investigating the crash, the downing of the plane, and for our convenience, he was very kind to bring the material so we can examine how this whole thing was done and organized and wrapped up by the Russians who investigated in their own case. And this is the last accent I wanted to say, something to remember, because these things are happening, and they did happen in the past. And history is the teacher of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Our last speaker on this panel is Dr. Phillip Peterson, the founding director of the Institute for Applied Science, former U.S. Army officer, served as an analyst in the DIA and OSD, and is an authority on weapons of mass destruction and the issues of proliferation. Dr. Peterson, please.
Actually, very little of those kind words are true.
Thank you.
I spent my years in Washington since 1977 studying first the Soviet and now the Russian General Staff, particularly focused on the operations directorate. I don't like the use of the words hybrid warfare. I think that we should stick with the way the Russians refer to it, which is new generation warfare, for a number of reasons which we will quickly review. I accept fully Vladimir Putin's view that we are engaged in an existential struggle between, to use their words, the Russian Eurasian civilization and the Atlantic civilization led by the USA. Generally, when the USSR collapsed, they saw liberalism defeating the last 20th century ideology, that is communism, to remain the sole ideology on the global arena. And they see themselves as this new ideology, which will be a neoconservative, post-liberal, ideological superstate. And their views, they will defend tradition, conservative values, and true liberty, which I define as the right to beat their wives and children. Essentially, in January of 2013, the chief of the Russian General Staff laid out his vision of new generational warfare and what this meant. And what we've seen from the various documents that we've looked at out of Miso are that they define new generational warfare as representing 9 different elements, which go from the simply information warfare and various forms of information warfare, all the way to the use of nuclear weapons. And all of that is part of this new generational warfare. We tend to think and talk about new generational warfare here as hybrid warfare, and what we focus is on the low end of this type of warfare. And actually, it tends to be focused on mostly special operations. In fact, special operations are just one element, or actually more than one, but elements in the mid-range. One of the graphics which I hope Dr. Carver brought, which he was counting on me to show you, illustrates that one can lay out these 9 elements in a chart which are both related to the covert and overt aspects of this new generational warfare. So all of these 9 elements can be played at or implemented at the same time. So essentially what he told his own officers at the General Staff Academy is that the main focus of warfare today is a combination of political, economic, informational, even humanitarian, and other non-military measures. And military power is only used to secure victory at the end. These are the 9 elements that have been identified in summarizing the character and content of new generational warfare. So we go from this non-military asymmetric warfare, special operations, intimidation, fraud, bribery, destabilization operations. Finally, at the fifth element, we get to the introduction of armed insurgents, clandestine military intervention, the use of electronic warfare and high-tech reconnaissance, then finally overt intervention, and the last ninth element is the use of nuclear weapons. Their operational planning is focused on three main factors: exploitation of ethnic and religious divisions. It's very similar to what the Soviets used to do with anti-coalitional warfare, to divide and conquer. The technical side of this is non-contact, net-centric type of warfare, where you don't necessarily have two enemies in contact with each other. You don't see your enemy to kill them. And then finally, nuclear weapons are fully integrated at every level of planning. And they're used either as a threat or they're used in the form of actual military use. At Potomac Foundation, we've looked at all of these military or these operational strategic scale exercises from Zawitkowski 99 all the way through Snapcheck at the end of this last year. I'm going to summarize these exercises. Essentially, you have an aggressor side and you have a friendly forces side. The aggressor side actually puts elements into the field. So during an exercise, GRU officers will go out and recruit local criminals and gangsters, of whom are all well known to the local intelligence service because they're paid off by them to be able to operate, and have them do the very things that they were doing in the Donbass. These separatist elements are supported by arms and advisors, and to avoid destruction of the separatist forces, diversionary regulars are committed as up to a Spetsnaz brigade in size. And then finally, the aggressor's traditional armed forces intervene to prevent defeat of rebellion. Now, these elements in the exercise are actually played. It's not notional. They're actually played so that they have developed the lower end of the new generational warfare that we see in the Donbass. And they've been doing this since 1999. The friendly forces, on the other hand, they attack the aggressor forces, they isolate the diversionary irregular forces like the Spetsnaz brigades, and then they use interior ministry forces to fight that local war, or partisan war, they will call it. And then eventually, in most of these exercises, the Russian forces employ nuclear weapons to isolate the conflict region from the aggressor reinforcement. In many of the Zapad exercises, they strike the bridges over the Vistula. They use them against Poland to warn everyone else. And actually, in some of these exercises, play the French and the Germans is remaining neutral. That is, not honoring their Article 5 commitments. And they even attack Atlantic coast ports in the United States as a means by which to isolate reinforcement. But they do it with non-missile force or non-strategic missile forces. These are cruise missiles off of long-range aviation, so as to convey a message to the United States that they are not looking to start a global holocaust. Now, you can say that there must be smoking dope or something to believe that we wouldn't respond, but that's what they actually practice. And the whole purpose is to use nuclear weapons, is to force the opponents, that is the West, into capitulation, what they call negotiating a successful conclusion of the conflict on their terms. Now, they actually have developed and developed the weapons and practice to implement a theory of using nuclear weapons to de-escalate. And they have identified 6 levels of such use. Dr. Carver put together this chart as a way to try and convey to Americans who think about nuclear escalation in a stepped NATO-style system that we used during the Cold War. They don't think of it that way. They think of discrete attacks or use of nuclear weapons on those 6 areas. And they might use an attack on Warsaw, limited attack, for strategic weapons anyway. They've just destroyed Warsaw. But the effect on other Europeans would be to cow them into submission. So they would select a level of use which would, in their view, have the greatest chance or opportunity to stop the fighting, to get the enemy to stop fighting. All right? It isn't a continued tit-for-tat kind of response. Now, the practical effect of operational strategic Russian exercises is in providing the aggressor forces for exercises. The GRU officers are trained to organize and lead terrorists and illegal armed formations under cover of deceptive measures. Spetsnaz brigades are trained to support separatist combat activities as a typical special operation, in a certain sense resembling textbook peacekeeping ones. Now these quotes are taken right out of their own materials, okay? So I'm not interpreting this. As a result of the exercises, Russian armed forces are trained to use partisan-style conflict that practically eliminates distinction between the actions of diversionary groups, the regular army, and partisan units that can be extraordinarily effective against opponents who rely only on regular units. And what it does as well is that it trains the Interior Ministry troops, the MVD troops, to pacify occupied areas once major offensive operations have terminated. Many in the West say the Russians couldn't attack the Baltic states, for example, until they pacified Ukraine, and they don't have a big enough army to do that. So we're safe. Not true, from a general staff's belief. We'll use Interior Ministry troops to pacify Ukraine, leave a couple of Spetsnaz brigades, and we can go off and fight a war with our regular forces somewhere else. In fact, if you go back and look at all the exercises as we did and count up the numbers, the average is 60% of the troops in the exercises, all these operational strategic scale exercises that I listed, were MVD troops, not regular army troops. So they can do a whole lot more than we traditionally think they can do when we only count the regular army. Now, this is the graphic that I wanted to lay out because Dr. Carver will be looking at because he's gone to the front in Donbass 13 times. He's done a lot of things there he probably shouldn't be doing. So I'm not going to say any more about his activities there. But he has seen the combat up front in the trenches, being surrounded, being fired at, behind the lines, meeting with the resistance folks. He'll talk about the high, more toward the overt end, although in the Russian lexicon, they even deny the obvious and say, of course we're not doing it, even though they're bragging to their own internal domestic audience that they're doing it. But to the U.S. press or the European press, they say, oh, nope, not us, and you can't prove it. But the idea is that all of these 9 elements play in a single strategy, and he just moves from one to the other. It's almost like playing an instrument, constantly undermining the resistance both of the country that he is trying to subdue as well as the rest of the civilized world. Finally, what they have also done is they have resolved their command and control issues for these operations. during the Cold War, military districts largely were mobilization organizations. They mobilized second echelon fronts, for example, to move forward. All right? And people used to say, well, they transformed into fronts. No, they didn't. Military districts never disappeared. Maybe the commander of that military district and the next group of forces were organized into a front and would move forward. But the MD didn't disappear because it still had a continuing mobilization base. All right? That was what its purpose was. They lost all this forward deployment with the Cold War ending. And so the problem was now how to resolve the role between the commands, which control operational strategic operations, and the MD. And they had a number of arguments about it over the years. This was reflected in especially Zavit 1999, and it was resolved by 2009. The high commands were going to be in the military districts. So they restructured the military districts so that they could perform both functions. So the high commands are already in the military districts, and they practice doing what they would do in a conflict. My one thing I would just mention to you now is that we should all be looking for September, because the Russians are planning a major operation or major exercise for September, which is not part of the Zapad series. So, to me, I think we should be especially concerned as we move toward this major event that they've already discussed. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. We're all on time, so the floor is yours, ladies and gentlemen. Questions to our panel, please identify yourself and to whom you are addressing your question. Switch this on.
A question for Professor Andrzej Nowak. You mentioned that the response of the Donald Tusk government John Trop, Polish-American Congress, New Jersey Division. I have a question for Professor Andrzej Nowak. You mentioned that the Donald Tusk government's response to the Smolensk disaster encouraged the governments of other countries in the region to defer to the Kremlin. Would you dilate on that? Would you explain specifically what the other countries in the region did to kowtow to Moscow?
So actually I can give several examples. First, the internal situation in Georgia. The fact that President Kaczynski was physically eliminated and his person was symbolically and practically very important to Georgia after August 2008 encouraged very much the change of political regime in Georgia and encouraged especially the pro-Russian, I could say agent actually, who took lead of the opposition party against Mikhail Saakashvili. His tenets that only with a regime that could establish relatively good or at least better relations with Russia, Georgia can survive, became more, I would say, persuasive after April 10th than before. And it paved the way actually to his success. I was also in Ukraine right after April 2010. And I remember, for example, covers of not just some far right-wing weeklies, but mainstream liberal weeklies that portrayed Putin and Tusk shaking hands under the title New Warsaw Pact. That Warsaw, represented by Donald Tusk and Putin, are colluding actually in order to isolate Ukraine and other Eastern European countries, which was actually stressed from the very beginning of Donald Tusk's prime ministership, because one should mention that the first foreign guest that was hosted by Prime Minister Tusk was Russian Federation ambassador. And our Prime Minister decided not to go to Kiev as every of his predecessors, but to Moscow. He visited Moscow first and only many months later Kiev. So he, even before the catastrophe in Smolensk, he presented his will to accommodate Moscow and Putin. But of course, it is a difference to present such a will and to do what was done by our government after such a catastrophe as April 10th, which was a total capitulation, a total, I would say, annihilation of Polish state dignity vis-à-vis the Russian Federation government. The fact that all, I would say, data and instruments to investigate this particular tragedy were given to General Attorney of the Russian Federation, who was at that time, exactly at that time, considered by the United States persona non grata for the United States due to his involvement in Magnitsky case, in Politkovska case, and in Litvinenko and Khodorkovsky case. All four cases were led by the same Vladimir Chaika that was given responsibility for finding truth about Smolensk catastrophe. Well, what else could be more persuasive for Ukrainians, for Georgians? But then we have this disorientation in Central Europe as well. While before Viktor Orban was looking for a kind of collaboration with Poland, afterwards he decided that the only way to withstand pressure from Germany and from Brussels is to go hand in hand with Vladimir Putin, because there was no partner in Central Europe. So actually, with no role for Poland in East Central Europe, there is a kind of vacuum, not of power, but vacuum of initiative. And this is taken easily by Vladimir Putin.
Thank you. Other questions for the panel? Yes, over there, please. You wait for the microphone, please.
It's Lucia Cannon. I wanted to ask Mr. Peterson about this basically placing the high command in military districts. So would you characterize that the Soviet military command and control is very decentralized, in fact, that there is a strategy and then the orders are given to these districts and they carried out the best they can, or does the direction come from Moscow?
Polish plans, or Russian General Staff plans, like Soviet General Staff plans before them, are all prepared in the Operations Directorate of the General Staff. So the plan is made and the forces are controlled via a command which is closer to the forces doing the fighting. So the high commands that have been established actually run the operations, but they do it with, one might call it oversight, or the assistance of deployed representatives from the General Staff. So the operations, at every level of command, and it's, I think what are they're called tactical battle groups, right, Phil? And they have been playing these, developing these ideas of about being able to take elements out of the brigades that have been created, all right? And usually it's a deputy commander of the brigade who controls one of these when they go into the Donbass, where the Russians have lost several general officers in Donbass. Controlling these units are actually doing the fighting, but the plan is created at the general staff level, and they're supposed to be implemented and overseen by the high commands in terms of providing the forces to be able to do that. But you will still sometimes see general staff officers all the way down to a tactical battle group that is in the field to make sure that they're doing what is part of the overall plan. And this is a type of leadership that the Russians have been working on, and the Soviets long before them, and developing, so that they don't want individual initiative. They have a plan, and they want everybody to execute the plan.
I think the minister, could we get the microphone over here, please?
Antoni Macierewicz. I have one question to Mr. Nowak and maybe some remarks to all of us. The question is such that you mentioned several goals of Putin politics in this moment of history, but you didn't mention, I think, the most important goal of Mr. Putin now, and it was openly said by Mr. Putin during the 17th anniversary of Second World War at Westerplatte in Poland in 2009. Mr. Putin said that he wanted to change the construction of political construction of the Europe and change from the European Union to the alliance between Germany and Russia. And he said it openly in one of the interview in Gazeta Wyborcza. I think that you know this text. And up to now, I think that it is the most important goal of the Mr. Putin. And now he more close this aim, this goal, that he ever be. I understand why this very precisely pointed the goal is not discussed here, because it's the problem which linked his politics with the German politics. And this is more important, because without the Germany, such politics it is not possible. And the remarks is such. I think that we can agree that the turning point of the history of the last 10 years in Europe was the Smolensk catastrophe and the death of the President Kaczynski and Polish elite which was with him in this plane. The next steps of the Russian expansion were the occupation of Crimea, Donbass, attack on Malaysian plane, and the murder of the Prime Minister Nemtsov. The mystery of the death of President Kaczynski is, I think, the base of the new political construction which helped the Russian aggression on the West. Like the Katyn murder was the base of the Soviet Empire, now the Smolensk tragedy is the base of the Russian aggression. And this is why it's so important to start an international investigation to know what really happened over the Smolensk and how died Polish president. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. The Berlin-Moscow axis.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much for this remark. Actually, I absolutely agree that this is one of the most important elements of Russian, I would say, operational strategy or operational method of its policy in Europe. But I would argue that this is not the only one. This is the most important for Poland, obviously, because Poland would be the cement of this particular operational tactic, or all East Central Europe being dominated by these two powers, that is Germany and Russia. But Russia has a global perspective as well. That's why it is important in Europe, but there are other options taken also seriously by President Putin. I mean, this vision of Russia joining Asia, so to speak, very generally, against the West is another option. And there are other, I would call them sub-options, discussed by different ideologies of contemporary Russia, not only Dugin, because Dugin is very consistent. Only Germany is our ally, that is Russian ally in Europe. This is this tradition of continental bloc, going as far as to Bismarck-Gorchakov through Rapallo and, of course, Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And this tradition is personally very, I would say, close to Vladimir Putin due to his experience in Dresden and his friendships with many German, I would say, politicians. Now I would call them rather cronies that serve in Gazprom, for example. But this doesn't mean, that is something that I want to stress, that Putin is a kind of I don't know how to say it, is somehow determined, but only this one particular scenario. What is important for him is that America is the enemy, and any coalition partner could serve Russia to undermine this main enemy. Germany is considered as a very, I would say, potentially good partner for such a policy, but not the only one. So that would be very shortly my answer, but I am really grateful for this reminder.
If I could add to this my dime, you mentioned this international investigation on Smolensk. It happens that one of the pieces of equipment that was found that was on that plane was the onboard computer that was built by the Universal Avionics from Redmond, Washington State, and it was examined here thoroughly. You know, the possibility for international investigation are very strong. I can only assure you that Polish organizations in the United States are boiling, because the rank and file members are pushing our leaders, Polish leaders here, to push for American congressional investigation, because there is an American content in this tragedy, because one of us, who was official delegate from Chicago, died during the downing of the plane. So there is going to be an American investigation to this because of American content. Just to add to what you just said, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, once more. Excuse me, may I? Only one sentence. Thank you for your answer, because 1 month ago such investigation was started by the Council of Europe. Thank you.
Please do access the reports that are available. I'd like to say, before we move on to our next panel, thank you so very, very much to our speakers.